The road outside Vannes was empty except for the wind, and then it wasn't. A young woman on a bicycle came around the bend, a basket strapped to her handlebars, and up ahead 2 German soldiers stepped into the road with their rifles raised, waving her to a stop. If you've ever wondered what it actually took to survive as a courier in Nazi-occupied France, this isn't a story stitched together from guesswork or Hollywood invention. It happened, and it's documented in military records, resistance archives, and post-war citations. Her name was Agnes de la Barre de Nantoul, and by the time checkpoints like this one became routine in her life, she had already spent nearly 2 years living a double identity so convincing that the soldiers pointing rifles at her had no idea who they were actually looking at. What you're about to hear is the real, verified story of a 20-something Frenchwoman who chose, checkpoint after checkpoint, to get back on that bicycle and keep going, knowing exactly what capture would mean. It is a story about silence as a weapon, about ordinary disguises hiding extraordinary risk, and about what she ultimately did the day the Gestapo finally caught up with her for good. Before we get to that moment, and if true, human, high-stakes history like this is the kind of thing that grips you the way it grips me, take a second right now to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It genuinely helps more people discover these forgotten stories, and there are far more of them still waiting to be told properly. Agnes was born in September 1922 near Paris, the eldest of 6 children in a family with generations of French noble ancestry behind it. Her father died while she was still young, and her mother, Sabine Cochin, moved the family to Brittany, first to a quiet rural estate near Thieux, then into the port city of Vannes. As a teenager, Agnes had a reputation for being headstrong and difficult to manage, and then, around 15, something in her shifted. She became devoutly religious and threw herself into the Girl Guides, the French scouting movement, learning discipline, navigation, and quiet self-reliance, none of it yet knowing how directly those skills would keep her alive. When German troops occupied Vannes in 1940, Agnes did what thousands of young French women did on the surface: she joined the Red Cross. It looked, from the outside, like an ordinary act of wartime charity, nothing more. She trained in first aid and earned her diploma in 1942, learning how to stop bleeding, splint a fracture, and keep a frightened person calm under pressure, skills that would matter later in ways no Red Cross instructor could have predicted. At the very same time, inside the very same household, her mother had already begun something far more dangerous. Starting in 1941, Sabine Cochin quietly built an escape network to smuggle downed Allied airmen out of occupied France, moving British and American pilots who had bailed out over Brittany through a careful chain of safe houses toward freedom. Agnes didn't watch from the sidelines. She stepped directly into her mother's underground world, and by 1942, under the wartime alias Claude, she had become a liaison agent working for a French naval officer running intelligence operations for the Armée Secrète across the Morbihan region. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into textbooks: what a liaison agent's actual working day looked like on those Breton roads. Agnes used her role as a scout troop leader as the perfect cover, a respectable young woman cycling between villages to visit her scouts, nobody's idea of a threat to the occupying army. Underneath that cover, she was moving intelligence reports, coded instructions, and information about hidden Allied airmen, often with messages physically concealed inside the hollow tubing of her bicycle's handlebars. She helped mark out fields at night so Allied supply drops could locate their landing zones safely. She carried word between resistance cells that could never risk contacting one another directly, acting as the fragile human thread holding a scattered network together. And every time she climbed onto that bicycle, she was staking her life on forged papers and her own composure, because the roads of occupied Brittany were laced with checkpoints, and there was never a way to know which stop would be the one where a soldier actually looked closely. This risk wasn't unique to Agnes. It was the daily reality for an entire generation of French resistance couriers, and historians have documented precisely why women were so often entrusted with it. German occupying forces, including the Gestapo, routinely underestimated women as harmless and unlikely to be seriously involved in resistance work, which handed women couriers something men in the same role rarely had: a plausible cover story and a soldier's willingness to wave them through without much scrutiny. Messages were hidden in loaves of bread, sewn into coat linings, tucked beneath babies in prams, folded into corset seams, wrapped in silk and knotted invisibly into hair ribbons. Women who cycled these roads learned to chat casually and pleasantly with German soldiers at checkpoints while quite literally carrying material that could get them shot on the spot, projecting exactly the right blend of politeness and boredom to make a tired soldier wave them through toward the next vehicle in line. It worked for years across occupied France, until, for many of these women, it stopped working entirely. For nearly 2 years, it worked for Agnes. She crossed checkpoint after checkpoint without incident, delivered message after message on schedule, and helped feed intelligence directly into Allied planning ahead of the coming invasion of Normandy. But the resistance network she belonged to was under constant, grinding pressure from German counterintelligence, and the Gestapo's most effective weapon was rarely clever detective work, it was torture. Captured resistance members were interrogated relentlessly, and information extracted under unbearable pain moved through the German intelligence apparatus with devastating speed, often within days. Throughout the early months of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for what would become the D-Day landings, pressure on resistance cells across France intensified sharply, and networks that had operated safely for years began unraveling member by member, arrest by arrest. Agnes and her fellow couriers had no way of knowing, on any given morning, whether a comrade was already sitting inside a Gestapo interrogation room being asked, over and over again, for names. In March 1944, the answer came for Agnes. A fellow resistance worker had already been captured, and under torture, gave up her identity to German intelligence officers. She didn't learn this from a warning message or a coded signal passed along the network. She learned it the hardest way imaginable. She returned home one ordinary day to find the Gestapo already waiting for her, inside her own house. There was no dramatic bicycle chase down a country lane, no last-second escape through a hedgerow. The moment her cover collapsed, it collapsed completely and without warning, in the one place she likely believed she was safest. She was arrested immediately and taken into German custody, and from that point onward, the young woman who had spent 2 years talking her way past checkpoints with a calm smile now faced something that no amount of charm or composure could talk her way through. If a story like this is landing for you, a real person, a real risk, a real price paid quietly for other people's freedom, this is exactly the moment to drop a comment and tell me which part of her story you didn't already know, or which detail struck you hardest so far. It genuinely shapes which stories get told here next, and every comment gets read. Because what came next for Agnes was brutal by any measure. She was imprisoned and interrogated repeatedly by the Gestapo, who wanted names, the identities behind her mother's escape network, the officer she reported to, the airmen she had helped hide, the safe houses, the routes, everything that could unravel the resistance web she had spent 2 years quietly building message by message, checkpoint by checkpoint. She gave them nothing. Not her network. Not her mother. Not a single name that could get another person killed. Session after session, she held that line, fully understanding what her silence was likely to cost her personally, and choosing it again regardless. She was far from alone in that kind of defiance. Other women couriers captured across occupied France around the same period faced strikingly similar ordeals, interrogated relentlessly for information they refused to surrender, subjected to methods designed to break the will long before the body gave out, and then transported onward into the German camp system regardless of whether they had confessed anything at all. What separated these women wasn't the absence of fear. None of them were fearless. It was what they chose to do with that fear when it mattered most. Agnes, like so many of her counterparts across France that same year, treated silence not as passive endurance but as an active, ongoing act of resistance, one grueling interrogation at a time, refusing to hand over the people who had trusted her with their lives, even as she paid an enormous and escalating physical price for that refusal. By August 1944, the Allies had already landed in Normandy 2 months earlier and were advancing steadily deeper into France, and the outcome of the war was becoming visible on every front, plain even to the occupiers. But that shifting tide did not save Agnes. If anything, the collapsing German position meant occupying authorities were in a hurry to clear their prisons before liberation arrived at the gates. Agnes was selected, along with dozens of other resistance prisoners, for deportation deeper into German-held territory. She was loaded into an old cattle wagon, the kind normally used to transport livestock, now packed wall-to-wall with political prisoners being sent toward camps inside the Reich. There was no comfort in knowing liberation was close. For the people locked inside that train, it may as well have been 1,000 miles away, because the train was moving in exactly the wrong direction, deeper into danger, away from the front lines finally advancing in their favor. On the 13th of August 1944, that train stopped at the railway station in Paris-le-Monial. What happened next is documented, though not certain in every detail. Historical accounts describe either an Allied aircraft strafing the train, a real and constant danger for any rail transport moving through France that summer, or a German guard opening fire to prevent a prisoner from attempting escape during the stop. Whichever it was, Agnes was struck and severely wounded at that station, mere weeks after Allied troops had broken out across Normandy and begun racing toward Paris, and mere months before her own region would finally be liberated. She did not die instantly. She lingered for several agonizing days afterward, gravely injured, and in that final stretch of time she did something that has been carefully recorded and remembered specifically because of how extraordinary it was. Before she died, she forgave the resistance worker whose confession under torture had led directly to her arrest. That single act, choosing forgiveness in her final days toward the person whose broken silence had cost her everything, is the detail that has followed Agnès de la Barre de Nanteuil through more than 80 years of French memory. After the war, she was honored posthumously with the Croix de Guerre, the Médaille de la Résistance Française, and the Légion d'honneur, and she was formally recognized with the rank of sous-lieutenant. She rests today in the cemetery of Bois-Moreau in Vannes, in the very region where she once cycled from village to village with messages hidden inside her handlebars. A graduating class of officer cadets at the French Military Academy of Saint-Cyr-Coëtquidon carries her name to this day, and streets and scouting groups across France still honor her memory, keeping alive the story of a young woman who turned a scout leader's bicycle into one of the quietest and most effective instruments the resistance had. What her story leaves behind isn't really about bicycles or checkpoints at all. It's about what ordinary-looking courage genuinely costs when it's tested to the very end. Agnès de la Barre de Nanteuil never fired a weapon, never blew up a bridge, never appears in the cinematic version of the French resistance most people picture in their heads. She rode a bicycle past armed soldiers who could have stopped and searched her at any moment, carried words that could get other people killed if discovered, and when they finally caught her, she protected those people with her silence until her body simply couldn't endure any more. That is what resistance actually looked like for thousands of young women across occupied France, unglamorous, terrifying, and quietly, devastatingly brave. If this story moved you the way it moved me while piecing it together, do one more thing before you go: subscribe if you haven't already, tap like so this reaches more people who need to hear it, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of what real courage under an ordinary disguise actually looks like. And down in the comments, tell me, what part of Agnes's story didn't you know before today?